Hello AP World History students, welcome in. For today we're looking at the Cold War. This is a conflict, I suppose, as famous as World War II. However, it is more complicated and it's stranger, right? It's like a conflict that lasts 45 years, right? It overlaps, the start of the Cold War overlaps with the end of World War II. It's really like it's a framework or dynamic that will shape world politics for half a century. And so because it's so complicated, my plan for this lesson here is to I'm kind of setting up the basic framework of this, right? Giving you the basic beats and starting the story off. And then I'm going to send you off with a couple supplemental videos that'll kind of tell individual episodes within the Cold War. The Cold War begins really during the end of World War II. And what's going to emerge is, like, as the dust settles from World War II, right? So many of the world powers from the previous couple centuries are depleted or defeated. And left standing are the two big allies, the Soviet Union and the United States. And they're sort of squaring off and facing off. And as we have come to understand, the Soviet Union and the United States have two fundamentally different worldviews and ideas and visions of what the good life is. The Soviets had this vision about like a government-run, a centrally run communist economy, right, where property is shared. It is very collectivist. It's very oriented toward egalitarianism, or toward, like, in the interests of equality between all classes. That's the vision. Of course, life in the Soviet Union, as we've learned prior to World War II, was no, walk in the park. It wasn't pretty, but like that's their vision. In the United States, like, we come out of this Enlightenment tradition, this tradition of liberal democracy that emphasizes freedom, right, and individual liberties as the primary good that can be created and protected in any political system, right? So that means like market-run capitalism. That means democracy or democratic choices, at least to some extent. And they're sort of going to pitch these two things, and each side is going to point sides at the other and say they're hypocrites, right? And the world is going to have to pick sides, and that's like, in a simple nutshell, what it is. Now, we know in our course, I mean, like, one of the things we do is like fathom the world's complexity. You guys have to understand, right? It's probably not that simple, and I'll say you're right. It's not really completely that simple. But let's begin, the story with how does it start? The Cold War, if you're going to say the Cold War is so-and-so's fault, you'd say it's the Soviet Union's fault. You'd say it's Joseph Stalin's fault. Right? This map kind of tells the picture, right? In red is the Soviet Union, in whatever, salmon or pink, are places that have been liberated from the Nazis by the Soviet Union, and that it becomes clear, very clear, in 1945 and 1946, that the Soviet Union, that Soviet tanks are going to stay parked in these places, right? That the Soviet Union has something to say about the sorts of nations that these places are going to become. They have liberated them from the Nazis, but are they going to allow these places to become free and independent, right? Short answer, no. Winston Churchill, who's a man who can coin a phrase, says it well, right? His quote here, when it's becoming clear to the West, to the rest of the world, what's happening here, he says, from the Baltic to the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of Central and Eastern Europe. The communist parties, which have been raised to preeminence and power beyond their numbers, are seeking everywhere to obtain totalitarian control. So what he's saying is, but during the war, before the war, there was, of course, a Romanian Communist Party. There was a Polish Communist Party, a Hungarian Communist Party. But now the Soviet Union, now with the Soviet tanks and the Soviet presence in these places, sort of plucks those parties and it places them in power, right? And it says to those parties, you will take your marching orders from us, correct? And they go, correct. This is an AP World History course, so for a moment, let me give Stalin's justification for this. I don't think it's super strong, but let's give it. Joseph Stalin said, we have this problem. In Russia, there's this problem we face, right? And the problem we face comes out of Western and Central Europe, right? The problem is you guys invade us. We don't invade you. Look back in the annals of history. You can't find big records of Russians invading Western Europe. However, from Napoleon to World War I to Hitler, you can find examples of us being invaded. We need some kind of buffer here. We need some greater protection between the bad guys who keep invading us and us. And so we're going to put kind of a pillow here between us and you guys, and we'll call that pillow, I don't know, Poland. So this chart here I like because it's kind of an overview, right? I mean, if you need this is like a thumbnail sketch of the Cold War, right? You have the Soviet Union and its allied Eastern Bloc nations, and then of course later you have communist nations like China or North Korea or North Vietnam, places you can add there. On the other side you have the United States and the Western democracies, right? And on the Soviet side, the goal, this is the stated goal of communism going all the way back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, which is worldwide communist revolution. And the Soviet Union, especially in those days, says we are here to sort of fan the flames of socialist and communist revolutions everywhere, right? To sort of bring this new stage of history to light. The stated goal of the United States and its Western allies is to contain or stop or halt the spread of this, right? And the idea that they're saying is we want to give people a choice as to what way of life they want, not to have it dictated to them by communist dictators. This conflict has a number of modes. You will note, this is key, none of the modes is direct combat between the two sides, and we'll talk later in this lesson about why. So some of the modes, an arms race, right? Each side is trying to one up the other in terms of the weapons stockpiles that they have, especially once we start building up atomic and nuclear weapons, sort of having more than the other is going to be a way of winning this thing. Ideological competition is key here, right? So you're trying to win the messaging war, and you're giving that message to your own public, but in large part you're kind of giving it to the third world, right? Not the first or second world. The first world being the Western world, second world being the Soviet and communist world. The third world is everyone else watching this. You're trying to pitch to them, come to our side, join our side. There is espionage and spying going on at a high degree between all the sides. There's these proxy wars where the United States doesn't go to war directly against the Soviet Union or directly even against China, a very large communist country, but against North Korea, right? We'll fight a proxy for the bad guys, or North Vietnam, we'll fight a proxy for them. And this also kind of tied to this involves sort of propping up sympathetic nations. So there's countries that are going to help you, like the United States will help Argentina, because Argentina is on the good side in the Cold War, even though the leaders of Argentina are not good people or good dudes, right? They're like caudillo strongmen, but they're on the right side here, and so you kind of support sympathetic nations even when they're not really all that awesome. This slide, you'll note the red line on this slide, and that is the so-called Iron Curtain, the divide between East and West. Now, Yugoslavia is a funny one. Yugoslavia is a communist system run by a dictator named Tito. Not a good guy, but Tito and the Soviets have their own little slap fights back and forth. They are not tightly aligned with the Soviet Union. So Yugoslavia is in kind of a no man's land. I'm going to give a little shout out to Yugoslavia too. My father-in-law and his family in 1951 fled from communism in Yugoslavia and moved to the Iron Range in Minnesota. And then I married his daughter. So there you go. There's my little shout out to Yugoslavia. Where nobody's sure where this is going to end, right? There's lots of nations. Greece and Turkey, you can see, are sort of not communist nations, but they're tucked in there on the eastern side of things. The Truman Doctrine is this announcement by the United States under President Truman that basically, hey, if you're a country and you're sensing Soviet meddling within your system, right, within your society, where they're trying to push toward a communist takeover in your country, let us know. The United States will help. We will pump money. We will give you military aid, whatever you need to resist the spread of communism. We'll do that. Now note, this means whether the United States has an existing relationship with you or not. right? It doesn't have to be our business. The United States says the problem is no one else can stop the spread, right? This is like a contagion going everywhere, and like if we don't step up and try to like plug the breach here, nobody else can. And so the Truman Doctrine is, we're going to step in and we're going to try and slow down this spread. Other moves taken to contain the spread of communism. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Note the countries in dark blue here. These are the original NATO nations. These are nations that allied themselves with the United States. The United States organized this, but it's sort of in cooperation with the nations of Western Europe to say, if one of us faces Soviet aggression, we all will stand up to it. Like we're sort of trying to pledge mutual defense to one another. And the United States, I want to be clear, is suddenly very, very involved in the affairs of the rest of the world, right? I mean, I want you guys to sort of imagine, like over this map, I still want you to kind of imagine like smoldering smoke coming up from Europe. That's still the case. We're just a couple years out of the war. The United States is sort of like trying to rush in and rebuild. Because part of the argument that Harry Truman, the president, makes is like communist systems, communist revolutions love chaos. Communist revolutions take place in squalor and mire and poverty. So we need to kind of rebuild, right? Because if we don't, this is just like dark, dank corners for cockroaches to hang out in. So the American Marshall Plan, right? $13 billion being spent to rebuild any nation that wants help rebuilding, right? Like we will bring in food, medical supplies, like we'll help rebuild factories, all this stuff. Pay us back later or don't, who cares? The point is we're trying to rebuild you. Right? You're going to remember where this help came from, and it's the more rebuilt you get, the less sympathetic you become toward sort of the chaos of communist revolutions. This is essentially an American run Western empire that's happening here. All right. But Americans, and certainly I would argue, it's built on humane values. It's not built on resource extraction or something like this. It's built on the idea that like democracy and political liberties are good. They're universally good. They're good everywhere. People are entitled to them. All right? And where people are not allowed to make those choices or not allowed to have those types of liberties and freedoms, that is bad. And we should stop the expansion of systems that take away people's freedoms and liberties. And the way you do that is through strength. We learned in World War II, you can't like avoid it by putting your head in the sand or just saying, not our problem, or why are we involved in this, right? Like, in the absence of strength, anarchy reigns. They said that was the lesson of the 1930s. And so now we want a robust response. This is going to be very expensive, but Americans and Harry Truman said, but what's the alternative? Consider what's the alternative. Germany is a tricky case, all right? I mean, Germany, of course, is like the center of World War II, and so the question of what happens there is key. And let's just say a solution to that question of what should happen to Germany was never found that was perfect for everybody. And so what ends up happening is Germany is split up, all right? The portion of Germany that the Soviet Union had sort of moved into and taken control of at the tail end of the war became what we call East Germany. In that portion of Germany, the German Communist Party was sort of propped up and put in power, and that became a Soviet satellite state or Soviet puppet state. In the rest of Germany, for a brief period of time, the British and the Americans and the French controlled certain like quadrants of it or segments of it, and soon enough, within a couple of years, the Americans and the British and the French like hand the keys over to local Germans and say, hey, it's your country, West Germany, right? If you want to help in Marshall and Marshall Plan aid and all this stuff, you can have it. And the West Germans said, yeah, we'll take it. West Germany becomes a free and democratic state. All right. And this becomes that great experiment that historian Neil Ferguson talked about, where you take one nation, you take one population, one set of resources, and one culture and one history, you split it up, and you say one half is going to be free and capitalist, one half is going to be, communist, and let's see what plays out here in the 20th century. And the story that's going to get told is that, the Western half, like far, far, far surpassed what was experienced in the Eastern half. All right. Now, Berlin is a trick. Berlin is the central city in the German economy. It's the capital city. And so Berlin itself was broken into two chunks, right? East Berlin was the communist half, and West Berlin is the free democratic half of that city. Now the trick is, as you can see in this map, Berlin is entirely contained within East Germany. And so what you had was like one little half city that was free and democratic, that is not contiguously connected to West Germany. And that's a peculiar accident of history. No one would have written it up. It just happened that way because all the sides were not able to come to some agreeable solution at the tail end of the war, because the Cold War hit the tail end of World War II, because the Cold War was already breaking out. And so by that weird accident, there was like a window for people in East Germany, in East Berlin. If you want to get out to the West, then sneak your way into West Berlin, and from there you can take any of the corridors. It's like special controlled highways from West Berlin to West Germany. You can hop on one of those corridors and be out, and once you're in West Germany, you have access to all the political freedoms that you would like. All right, and you can pursue happiness as you see fit, to use American language here, right? And 3.5 million people did that over the course of about a decade. These people said, I want to work, I want to make money. I'm never going to make real money in a communist system, so they make their way out. This is an obvious embarrassment to the Soviet Union. It's an obvious embarrassment to East Germany. They're eager to just stop the flow of people out of their system into the West, and so they build the Berlin Wall. All right? That Berlin, we talk about walls in American society today, and there's the Trump wall or the wall at the border. The Berlin Wall is an embarrassment to the Soviet legacy. That's not a wall to keep people from coming in. That's a wall to keep people from getting out. The Berlin Wall is built as an admission of the fact that your own people wanted out of your system. And you're saying, no, nobody gets out, right? We're all staying in here. We're all staying in this system. And that wall became a symbol worldwide of the weird ideological clash happening here. A long-standing legacy of the division of Germany. Take a look at this, right? The German states in red are where the primary religious affiliation is no religion, right? That's the influence of communism and communist propaganda on those populations, whereas in the rest of Germany, you see Catholicism or Protestantism being the primary religious expression. Not so much, East Germany is long gone, unless you look at the cultural attitudes and you say, oh, there it is. This was worldwide. The Cold War becomes a hot topic in Asia, right? China, in the wake of World War II, the Chinese Communist Party would take power there. Oh my gosh, that's a huge country, albeit pretty poor in those days, but a huge country that now goes on to the red side. And there is this notion, this idea of domino theory that was held by people in the West that communist revolutions beget more communist revolutions, right? Like once communists have sort of achieved a communist dictatorship in one country and sort of like a totalitarian system is in control there, they don't just sit tight, then they tend to move on to the next place. And that frequently was true. And so domino theory was, whenever any domino is like tottering and on the verge of falling, in the interest of containing the spread of communism, you have to race in and stop it and prop it up and prevent that from happening. And so the US and the United Nations and Western powers ends up fighting a war in Korea, which was not a place of any wealth or really geopolitical significance at all, except in this Cold War context where the northern half, again, Korea had always been one thing, but in the wake of the war, they just sort of cut it in half and let the communists take control, let Russia take control of the north, and the Americans take control of the south, and so these two halves emerge. Then the communist northern half tries to invade and take over South Korea. What happened in the Korean War is we preserved South Korea's existence. South Korea was just about on the way out the door. Today, South Korea is a great nation and a great testament to political and economic freedoms. And North Korea is not. And so that's like a legacy or a scar that's left on the world from the Cold War. Last thought is the arms race. One expression of the Cold War was this weapons buildup between the two sides, and this is really horrifying, right? For a while, the United States thought that it was safe and secure because we had this atomic bomb that we used at the end of World War II. But then in 1949, the Soviets unveiled that they have an atomic bomb as well, thanks to Soviet spies who were in the American system who stole atomic secrets from the United States. The US says a few years later, well, now we've got a hydrogen bomb, which is 1,000 times more destructive than the weapons used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's like, okay, problem solved, I guess, until a few years later when now the Soviets have a hydrogen bomb too, and we're just like this, like racing up to our eyeballs with nuclear weapons and missiles that can deliver a nuclear blow from farther and farther away. And what's happening, the term for this whole buildup eventually became mutually assured destruction. And the idea is a perverse one, but it's just like we've built up so many weapons that now we're actually safer because both sides understand if you push the launch button, the other side will destroy you, right? Pushing the button to use nuclear weapons means you are committing suicide. And so as long as both sides are being rational, they will never be used. As long as both sides are being rational. The problem is, as you guys know, there's times in history where I don't know that all people were being rational at various points in history. Or our understanding of human nature is rationality a part of our nature that God built into us? Yes. Is it all that, or is that only it? No, it's not. So yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it off. I've kind of started the ball rolling, and now I want you guys to go off and explore some different episodes in this. And yeah, after that, I just want you guys to have a great weekend. Okay, so take care. God bless. See you soon.